I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Almayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Almayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, for Almayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, the Gulf states that are in the news in Britain. A young British student, after a 4-minute trial, in which he had no lawyer, was sentenced to life imprisonment for spying. It's not clear why Britain would have to spy on the United Arab Emirates, a country which Britain was decisive in creating and which we're told has a very close intelligence and military relationship with Britain. Well, we kind of knew that. The mystery is why they had the temerity to treat a British student in such a way. But it's not just the United Arab Emirates which is in the news. In Oman, long after Britain withdrew east of Suez, which they did when the Beatles were #1 in the hit parade, and the Beatles are more than 40 years dead. We are supposed to have left all that behind, but now we have established not one, but 2 new military bases in the Gulf. And one of those is in Oman. Did you know that until the mid-60s, when the Beatles were kings, half of all Oman's revenue was transferred directly to London? That in the 1960s, every minister bar one in the Omani government was a British military officer? That the Defence Secretary of Oman was a British soldier, and that its foreign policy was entirely the province of the government in London. As a matter of fact, Oman only had diplomatic relations with one country in the world. That's right, Britain. Britain sent its army to fight the Omani people when they rose up to overthrow a corrupt dictator. And he was overthrown eventually by his own son, with British security and military advice, I think they call it. And in Bahrain, Britain has now established a naval base, paid for by the Bahrainis. How lucky are we? So, having withdrawn in the 1960s from everywhere east of Suez, Britain is back. What kind of countries are these that we are so deeply involved in? Well, the aforementioned United Arab Emirates, together with Saudi Arabia, with whom we have an equally close intelligence and military relationship, they are wading in the blood of the people of Yemen next door. Literally wading in blood. They have killed hundreds and hundreds of children. They have killed tens and tens of thousands of civilian people. And they are still doing it as I speak, even though General Mad Dog Mattis, the Defense Secretary of the United States, has told them to stop. I wonder what happened to that. He said it had to stop immediately. He said he even named the place, practically the restaurant that they'd be dining in Sweden, where he insisted peace talks would begin. But they have not. There is no peace in Yemen. There is only death and the stalking shadow of cholera and famine. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, according to the Wall Street Journal, have actually sent soldiers now to American-occupied Syria. That part of Syria which is occupied by ISIS the United States, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. So pretty soon, if not already, Saudi and UAE forces will be killing Syrians, and probably some of them will be killed back. The human rights of these countries is a legend. In Bahrain, the recent elections were a farce because most of the MPs are here in London or living elsewhere in exile or in jail in Bahrain. And don't get me started on elections in Saudi Arabia. These countries, some of which are merely petrol stations flying flags, are playing a decisive role in regional and world events. And they're doing so as proxies for the United Kingdom and the United States. And they have a lot of blood on their hands. What could Britain first have seen in Oman that made her fall in love with it? Was it the sand? Was it the coastline? Or was it the fact that Oman sits at the entrance to the Straits of Hormuz, and they already saw the strategic importance of that? What does Britain see in Bahrain beyond its deep water port facilities, its proximity to Saudi Arabia, which has taken the place that India once had in British imperial fantasy? Once upon a time, everything about British foreign policy was about India. Nowadays, everything about British foreign policy in the Arab Middle East is about Saudi Arabia. Oh, and Iran. About checking Iran. About keeping a stranglehold on Iran. About regime change in Iran. That's why we're there. It's a bit less easy to work out why the Arabs there consider that a good thing. It's a bit less easy to work out why any self-respecting Arab, never mind any self-respecting Muslim, could tolerate a situation where these foreigners are keeping tyrants in power, not so that they can develop their own country, but so they could continue to fill our pockets whilst keeping some for themselves. We have here an audience of distinguished experts, not all of whom agree with me by any means on what I've just said or will say. We also have one or two enthusiastic amateurs, like me. Let's turn to one of those experts first. Charles Shoebridge is a former British Army officer, a man who was once deeply involved in intelligence work, in legal work, in police work. Nowadays, he tells the truth on television and radio, often with me. Charles Shoebridge, welcome to the show. What's the key to Britain's relations in the Gulf, and why have they suddenly kicked on? Why didn't we continue as we were? Why are we now re-establishing bases in places that we left decades ago?
Yes, you're absolutely right. What we're seeing is a massive expansion very, very recently, and it is only recently in the last decade or so. I mean, we've kept very close ties to these countries throughout that period. You're right, we withdrew in the 60s and 70s from this region, and of course it was even more arguably crucially important to Britain in terms of oil supplies and so on at that time than it is now. But nonetheless, so the reason we withdrew was largely down to money. We didn't have much money. But when you look at the government's austerity drive here, for example, in the UK, where there are cuts to police, cuts even to the military, of course, the army is struggling to get recruits and so on.
To the Navy, which is going to be based in these places.
Absolutely. And of course,
we've got aircraft carriers with no aircraft on them.
That's absolutely right. But you still got now, despite the fact you still got these very acute shortages of funding, nonetheless, there has been a reversal of this policy so that now we're opening, as you say, not one, but two bases quite close to each other, but both of which, of course, are very strategically important for the British, or rather perhaps for the British-American relationship, so that the Americans, of course, have their main fleet. One of their main fleets is based in Bahrain as well. Funnily enough, at the old British base, it's centred upon that. So Britain is now building a new base there, has just opened that, of course. as you say, paid for by the Bahraini authorities. And that's an indication, I think, a clue there that this is a mutually beneficial relationship, not necessarily between the Bahraini or the Omani people and Britain, but the governments that rule those effectively dictatorships, absolute monarchies, for example, in the case of Oman. Britain sees its role there is part of the American strategy to, of course, support Israel and other friendly countries that, of course, are opposed by Iran. Even if you just look at the map, you can see very clearly that the position of these two bases isn't about necessarily getting oil supplies out from the Persian Gulf. It's about dominating the Persian Gulf, or at least having a very big presence there. Both of these bases, which will inevitably be used largely by American forces, are absolutely positioned properly to target Iran. Also, of course, they are crucial, and I think this is important in the Bahrain case especially, that they send a signal that Britain supports the ruling families of those countries. That means that Britain is sending a signal that perhaps even there would be military intervention, we don't know this for sure, to support those nations or those royal families were they to be challenged, for example, by their own people. That might be, for example, particularly in the case of Bahrain, of course, with a Shia majority there, it could easily be marketed in the West as some kind of Iranian proxy invasion or uprising, the same way as the Houthi uprising or rebellion in Yemen is being marketed in terms of we must combat Iran, therefore we must support Saudi Arabia. And so there is this grand strategy, but also I think there's a bit of a tail wagging the dog here, because after all, we've got a very, shall we say, very ambitious defence policy. You mentioned the two aircraft carriers, hugely expensive projects which Britain has undertaken, which together with the nuclear deterrent that we've got with the Trident submarine and its replacement is absolutely dominating the defence budget to the extent that it's difficult even to find sailors and soldiers to actually carry out the missions we already have. And there are many, even within the military, I think, that point to these two projects, these two huge capital projects, the two aircraft carriers and the nuclear deterrent, that is really weakening and draining, sapping away the strength of more conventional forces that many believe that Britain more urgently needs. And it's interesting, too, that the two bases that we're talking about here have both been designed to service the aircraft carriers. In other words, they have been made large enough, for example, in the Bahrain case, to service these both very large ships. And it's almost as if there's, okay, now we've got these aircraft carriers, and these aircraft carriers, remember, not many people are using in their defence of them. I'm talking about Defence Minister, the senior admirals and so on. They don't say this is vital to defend Britain. What they say is this is vital for Britain to be able to project power. That's the phrase that's used all the time. And of course, therefore, you have to wonder where is projecting power most likely to take place. And again, we look at current situation in the world, some of which you've covered and which I know more will be covered later. And of course, we have to look, therefore, at the Middle East. And so Britain is still trying to, of course, maintain not necessarily a grip, but a very decisive influence in this area, regardless of the fact that it doesn't seem to have tangible results for Britain, apart from perhaps for arms sales, which I'm sure we'll come on to these regions, but also in supporting these effectively dictatorships, which are nonetheless very friendly to the United Kingdom and therefore to the United States. And so what we've got is this mutually beneficial arrangement, largely paid for, of course, by the UK taxpayers.
That's been very helpful. Let me ask you two questions which arise. You're certain, are you, that this represents Britain acting as an auxiliary to the United States and doesn't represent some kind of wish by the British to have a more independent presence in the region? And secondly, it was a Labour government under Harold Wilson that withdrew Britain east of Suez. What about any incoming Labour government in Britain now? Would Jeremy Corbyn keep these bases, do you think?
The problem is now that, of course, with defence spending, you're looking at a long-term projection. So, for example, you can't order an aircraft carrier or cancel an aircraft carrier just with a moment's notice. It's a huge project lasting a decade or more. And then, of course, for 40 years in service. It was already shown that even if the government had wanted to cancel the second aircraft carrier, which for budgetary reasons they were thinking of doing, it would cost more to cancel it now than actually to have had it and keep it in the first place. And so it's almost a situation where you've got these amazingly expensive capital projects which now you have to find a use for. There's an element of that, but also there is, I think, within the British military and security establishment, especially under this rather gung-ho defence secretary we've got now, although these decisions preceded him, to have a more assertive, what we would call, if it was Iranian or Russian aggressive, we would call, of course, if it was the same kind of policy that they were putting out, but an assertive foreign policy that isn't necessarily independent of the United States, but which is complementary to it. I think there are many within the British security establishment who see that if we can provide more military assets, we will have more influence with American policy, even, or perhaps despite, or perhaps because of at the time when American foreign policy is becoming more and more insular, shall we say, and we've got people like Trump who more and more perhaps are leading America into more of an isolationist policy. And I think that is a big fear amongst Arab leaders who have relied on American support and perhaps now are seeking to have Britain as a substitute for America in case America withdraws.
What about the fact that Britain has a different policy towards Iran than America does? And the Omani base, indeed the Bahraini one also, are direct threats to Iran. But Britain is insisting on the Iran nuclear deal going ahead, being held to, whilst Trump has ripped it up. Is there any real substance in that difference, in your view?
I think there is. I think that the key differences here, of course, is that Britain would like to see actually more trade with Iran because of business interests. Secondly, I think there is a desire within Europe, because it's Europe, after all, not the United States, that would be within range of these alleged Iranian nuclear-tipped missiles that would come on stream if the Iran nuclear deal, at least that's the fear, fell through. So it's Europe that would be within the range of these missiles. So it's Europe that's possibly threatened by these developments. And so, of course, it's Europe that's in the forefront of really wanting to keep this deal in place. Plus, of course, I think there's an understanding that with something that was so clear in terms of the Iranian nuclear deal, that America has reneged, if you like, it's withdrawn from, but effectively it's reneged from an internationally agreed deal. And I think there's a feeling that this sets a poor precedent for agreements in the future. We already had, of course, in terms of taking it outside the Middle East, the Korean situation, where, of course, only one person really within the Korean decision-making machinery must, of course, be questioning, well, even if we have a deal with the United States, with South Korea, Japan perhaps, to not have a nuclear program, will America honor its commitments that it would then make? Because the Iranian deal, of course, suggests that America won't agree its commitments. It will simply, when a new president comes along, rip that up and demand an even more onerous deal with Iran. And so, yes, there are differences. Of course, it remains to be seen if Brexit happens again, because I think this is a factor too, that Britain, of course, is increasingly desperate to announce trade deals, announce close relations outside of the European sphere that it's relied on up till now.
Very interesting. Who'd like to contribute next? Yes, sir?
I think Britain is British government is putting the British people in danger and risk in the future by doing such expansion in the Gulf, probably substituting the American existence or supporting. We don't know yet, it's not clear to us. We view British existence in Bahrain now as an illegal, because they had an agreement, strike an agreement with government not being elected by us in Bahrain. And we still have in our memory that British government is the one who have created this tyranny in our country and supported all the way since they withdrew, between bracket. But we know also they withdraw militarily, but they had their man in Bahrain, which is Ian Henderson, for years and years, running the security forces. Now, British is coming back openly, and we view it as an open support to dictatorship and tyranny. And the question is why? Our people demanded democratic transformation, but we choose a peaceful way. We thought in 2011 that British government would support democratic transformation because they raised this as one of the British value. But in contrary, they did the opposite. Also, we look at British government as the main producer of the Zionist existence in our region, Israel, and the main producer of tyranny. So we see this product as a British product. Now, is this connected to normalizing the relation between Israel and the Gulf state? We see Netanyahu going to Oman, and now he is announcing going to Bahrain, and we see British existence in Oman and in Bahrain. Is that a start?
That's a very interesting theory. I'm going to come back to that after the break. And don't forget that Israel was very recently also in the UAE.
Yeah.
So this axis, if I might call it that, is perhaps a part of the answer to these conundrums. You're watching Kalima Horra. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Almayadeen television, talking about the Gulf and Britain's troubled relationship with it. Troubled, at least, for some people. We took the Kalima Horra camera onto the streets of London to hear what the people thought. Let's take a look.
Do you think Britain is right to extend military bases into the Middle East again?
I think Britain has enough military bases. I think they should be pulling out of some of the places that they have military bases. I'm actually Irish. I'm from the Republic of Ireland. We were colonised by the British. It was not very pretty. They're very merciless. I speak English because the British murdered everyone who was speaking our own language in our country.
I think that Britain needs to take a leadership role because they always have, right? They were a leader in the world for many years and still are today. They're very understanding of other people and other cultures, and I think what they're doing there is to help, not to hurt.
No, I don't think it's right. I don't think we should be building military bases in other countries. Many, many years ago, I lived at Greenham Common to get rid of the nuclear warheads from America. So my beliefs haven't changed since then.
They haven't been away. They've been, the Bahrain and Oman are two places where they've had a long association, and because they work so closely with the Americans have had a big naval presence based in Bahrain.
I think it's a bad idea, but to them it's a good idea because they're the first world, so they're trying to make sure they keep up with any other nations that are trying to come up.
Do you think these military projects have got anything to do with Brexit?
I don't think that's got anything to do with it. I think it's a much longer term strategy between Britain and the Middle East.
I don't think it has to do with the expansion of military troops.
Whether it's Labour, whether it's Conservative, whether it's Liberal Democrats, they will still be involved. By the military and those things, it stays the same. It stays the same. Their purpose is to make sure they're up and up with the current affairs of the Middle East particularly.
I actually don't know, if I'm honest. I really don't know why they've come about more recently than they were before.
I actually think the British need to just chill out a bit and just stop trying to control so much in the world.
Absolutely splendid example of my fellow countrymen and women, and especially the Irish lady. Now, we were talking before the break about what the international meaning all of this might have. You speculated one of them. It's certainly happening in tandem with the normalization of relations with Israel by actually almost all of the Gulf countries. I went into a lift in Doha once, and when the lift door opened, Shimon Peres walked out of the lift. That was before these kind of things were publicly announced. You mentioned in Oman, I mentioned in the UAE. Saudi Arabia is undoubtedly meeting Israeli retired generals and retired diplomats at various events around the world, but it doesn't seem likely that under MBS, at least, Saudi Arabia will stay long out of that embrace. The other international ramification is the one that Charles Shoebridge mentioned, which is us acting in tandem with the Americans. Comment on that if you would, please. But also, tell me this. How do the Arabs see this? Because this is the shoe that never drops. Because there is no free media in these countries, we can't know what the attitude of the people in these countries to this is. But you'll be able to help us with that, please.
I think Britain have failed in creating states in the Gulf, proper established countries. They still a kind of tribe ruler in the Gulf. On the other side,
I don't think that's a failure. I think that was intended.
Yeah, but somehow
in that case, you really should rephrase that. We succeeded.
they need somehow to market it as a state. They need somehow to stabilize the region. And without having somehow a semi-state, it won't stay forever. Because in the Gulf, the youth now is above 50%. And those youth have studied in the Europe and America and other places, and they want to be part of the decision-making process. So that's a failure for Britain in forecasting the future. They also failed with the American to normalize the relation between what they called Israel and the Arabs and Muslims. And they are feeling the danger of the existence of this country. And because of the producer is Britain, I think they are coming back for that reason as well. Now, British coming back to the Gulf state, are they substituting the American or supporting the American? That's another question we need to put in the consideration. But anyway, they're risking, and I need this message to go across Britain, they're risking British interest in the long run because they're building relation with dictatorship, with tyranny, and this tyranny, we don't see them exist in the coming 10 years. People in the Gulf demand democracy, and democracy doesn't work with Zionism, with the existing of Israel. People in the Gulf do support Palestine, and they will continue supporting Palestine. So British coming back, they want to make sure the like of MBS and Al-Khalifa exist and continue ruling the Gulf.
All our bets are on these regimes continuing in power. If they fall, it's your case that Britain will somehow lose from having been their principal backers. I'll come back to you later. Let me take the gentleman in the middle there. Yes, sir, what's your point of view?
So Britain still lives in the past. I think we believe we're still an empire, which we are not at all. But wherever we have influences, because we have ruled there, they don't want to take away those influences. Rightly so, because if you look at any world power, whether it's America, Russia, China, nobody want to give up the influence they have in their sphere. It's very difficult to do that. The other reason they don't want Gulf countries to be democratic, or wherever they have influence, because with democracy comes people's power. Those countries, whether it's Bahrain, Saudi, Oman, they have to do what their people want. So they have to put these puppet regimes, I call them, so that they do their bidding and do what they ask them to do. And in what they get is safety, that they will not be gone like MBS, everybody's trying, including Trump, to save him. So I can't see anything changing in that. The only hope I personally had was in 2010-11 when the Arab Spring started, and somehow everybody tried their best to not make it successful. That was the only hope. Now, sadly, we had to go back to the ground, people in those countries like in Bahrain, anywhere, and start again, just like we are doing here with Jeremy Corbyn. I'm not very optimistic.
You're not optimistic. Anyone optimistic? Yes. Gentleman in the front, he's not optimistic. Let's get all the pessimism out of the way. First, go ahead, sir.
Not optimistic at all. I think the problem that we're seeing now, and we've spoken about what was the intent of the British, whether it was to create stable democracies or not. I think whatever the intent is, what we have to look at is what we have now.
What happened, yeah.
There are no stable democracies in the Middle East. I mean, you've spoken about the UAE role in a number of different other countries. I mean, let's look at what they did in arming Khalifa Haftar in Libya. Let's look at what they've done with Sisi in Egypt. Let's look at what they're doing in Yemen. I mean, the UAE is generally regarded by people in this country as sand and sun. It's a wonderful place to go on holiday. I personally consider it one of the most dangerous parts of the Middle East, right alongside Saudi Arabia. But the fact of the matter is they are all dictatorships. They are not democracies. There are no opposition political parties. There is no free press. The biggest concern that I have as a barrister, as a human rights lawyer, is that we are now at a stage of a global crisis where there is no accountability, there is no human rights protection. I mean, to listen to the foreign minister from the UAE talking about the case of Matthew Hedges in particular.
I want to ask you about that. You're not just a barrister, but a very well-known and distinguished one. If the UAE is, as I have long thought and said, effectively a British and American protectorate, why did they act in this way with a young British student? A 4-minute trial, no lawyer, life imprisonment. That's not actually the behaviour of a puppet state, really.
Well, because I think it's what we've seen with a number of dictatorships and autocracies is they will push the mark as far as they can. And if there is no red line in the sand being drawn, then they'll keep pushing that. I mean, if we look at 3 cases in particular, so we look at Matthew Hedges, we look at the case of Jamal Khashoggi, and we look at the case of the ruler of Dubai's own daughter, who we believe was abducted and killed because of her speaking out. You look at those 3 cases in point, it's because individuals in these positions of authority do not consider themselves bound by the ordinary rules and laws as you and I. They do not consider themselves to be bound by that, and they will continue to push that. The UK, they know that the UK is weak. They know that the United Nations system is weak, that there is no form of holding them accountable. And one of the questions that was asked in the Vox Pop was about whether this has a connection to Brexit. I strongly believe that it does. We have seen, certainly over the last 12, 18 months, much more tolerance by the UK with these autocratic regimes. And so unless the UK actually stands up and says, enough is enough, we're not going to tolerate this anymore, you are not our friend. Other European countries are doing this to the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Why are we not? Why are we tolerating that? I mean, if you read the statement by Trump, his recent statement in relation to the evidence coming out about Jamal Khashoggi, well, maybe MBS knew about it, maybe he didn't. But what's important to us are the trade deals. That's what's important. And I'm no...
Although Trump, Toby, was... you can always count on him to be vulgarly honest. He said you wouldn't last 2 weeks without our support. Now, that's a truth that has long remained unspoken by more polite politicians with, forked tongues. But Trump's right, isn't he? So actually, these are not independent actors. Saudi Arabia, Oman, the UAE, Bahrain, and so on, these are absolute dependencies, dependent on the ongoing military, political, and diplomatic and media support of the West.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that goes without saying, is that, it's not just a matter of we're not bound by your rules. We know that in the background we have your full support, and you're not actually going to take any action against us because it's not in your interest to take any action against us. But, going back to Trump's position, and I'm no supporter of Iran. I think the human rights situation in Iran is as bad as all of the other countries we're talking about. But his entire statement was about Iran when it should have been about Saudi Arabia. Iran is bad, Saudi Arabia is our friend. His entire statement
could be boiled down to that.
On that. And yes. he actually made one very important point that I missed, and I think most people missed, and it was pointed out to me by a colleague yesterday, when he talks about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. And he said if Iran were to pull out, Saudi Arabia could provide the humanitarian assistance, which means they can provide the humanitarian assistance whenever they like. And I think that's an important point that Trump didn't think through when he prepared his speech. And it really does demonstrate what the current US administration position is as far as Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the Gulf states are concerned. And it is deeply worrying.
All of this rests on two things, though, neither of which is necessarily stable. As I think we saw to some extent in the Vox Pop, it relies on the Arab public never rising up and overthrowing their rulers. And it relies on our public opinion not to give a damn. Now, I felt after the Khashoggi case in particular that our public opinion is capable of being roused in revulsion at our relationship with these regimes. Don't you think so? Isn't that a ground for optimism?
I think that is a ground for optimism. And I think that the Jamal Khashoggi case in particular, I mean, it's a case in point as to educating the people of this country as to what is actually happening there. People, I think ordinary people, do not understand quite how bad things are. That's why people continue to go to the UAE, for example, because they do not know how bad it is until, frankly, the shit hits the fan. They don't know that. Look at the woman who was arrested for having been served alcohol on an Emirates flight.
Never understood that.
Most British people
the
don't.
Emirates airline was pouring wine down the woman's throat, and then they arrested her for drinking alcohol when she arrived.
Which, arguably, as a lawyer, you would say that's aiding and abetting a criminal offence. Yes. So we have to wake up to.
And they advertised their services on British television that they serve alcohol.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
We'll be right back. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Almayadeen television, coming to you from London, but discussing the Gulf. But, of course, Britain, and for that matter, the United States, tortured relations with the Gulf. We took the camera out for Kalima Horra on the streets of London. Let's see how it went.
At the moment, France and Germany have both stopped arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Britain has not. Can you say why?
Why have people not selling arms? Well, obviously, because there's money to be made.
Well, the very simple reason is that France and Germany don't really do much arms trading with Saudi. They get most of their arms from Britain and America. And the reason why we're still doing it is the money.
Simple.
I really think that I'd like to think of any sort of trade as being an economic thing, hopefully not a military thing. Unfortunately, when you're talking about arms, you're talking about military.
They clearly know every single civilian that died in the airstrikes done by Saudi Arabia is blood on the hands of Britain.
I think if Germany has done that, we need to maybe think about why they've done it. You know, we raise money all the time for things like cancer research. You don't see many charities raising money for arms, do you? Because they have enough money to raise arms. So why are we raising money to keep people well, but we're happy to put money into blowing people up?
Do you think Britain's presence in the region is going to be a good thing or a bad thing for countries like Yemen?
It will be a bad thing, yeah, absolutely, it's a bad thing, because right now what they're doing is British soldiers are not there. As far as I know, they're not there now, but it's as if they're there. It's as if British army is there killing the civilians because you're selling the weapons to the Saudis.
Actually, I think it will, because the British government, the British people, are people that are very worldly and go around, and I think that people understand that they are there to help, not to hurt, and I hope that people realize that, because that is what the British people are all about.
They might, if it's balanced. And I think having a good, clear guidance on why they're there, so that the troops on the ground understand why they're there. But I think that's a utopia.
To be honest, it'll have no effect whatsoever. I think that the reasons for the war in Yemen are regional rivalry between Iran and Saudi, Shia against Sunni, and those things are being played out, you know, all over between Turkey and Qatar and Saudi and Qatar and Saudi and and Turkey.
I have no idea whether Britain putting their stamp in another country is a good idea. No.
Julian.
Thank you, George. The Arab Spring seemed to be most successful in countries that had presidents rather than kings. And maybe our Arab friends can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that the Arab people are more accepting of a dictator who was born into power than a president who took power. So Britain will be better off supporting families rather than...
Even those have been reversed, haven't they? Mubarak was overthrown,
there you
but
go. One president
Sisi is Mubarak plus or minus, depending on your point of view.
Yeah.
The Tunisian president was overthrown, but his people are largely back. So I'm not sure that the Arab Spring actually achieved anything at all in the end.
But did it even get going in the places that have monarchy?
Yeah.
Jordan is stable. Morocco seems stable. I don't know if Bahrain is...
Everywhere seems stable until it isn't. Tunisia looked pretty stable to the holidaymakers, and then a spark was lit literally when someone set fire to themselves, and the earth shook. But it didn't last long, and I think that's the point, that all is not lost necessarily for the British and the Americans when a ruler is overthrown, if they can take control of the subsequent events and correct them, move them into useful channels. But maybe so. This would accord with the gentleman's point of view that that tribalism is still powerful in these monarchies, and people are responding to the tribal call rather than the democratic one. Charles, I wanted to ask you, sounds like a naive question, but I am amazed at the Saudi appetite for weapons. I literally don't know where all these weapons could possibly be. Saudi Arabia is not a military power, as we can see in Yemen. It has completely failed to quell very poorly armed and defended fighters in Yemen. If I tell you that 30 years ago, I was sent to Saudi Arabia by the British government as part of a small group of Arabist parliamentarians to smooth over some hiccups that were occurring between Britain and Saudi Arabia. We were led by the late Francis Pym, the former British Foreign Secretary, later Lord Pym. And Lord Pym announced to us our mission was soft soap, he said. Soft soap, fellows. We can't apologize, we can't explain, but we can liberally slap on the soft soap. Now, the reason was we had recently signed the biggest arms deal at that time in all history, maybe still until now, the Al-Yamama deal. And I wondered then, what are Saudi Arabia going to do with all these weapons? They don't have enough soldiers to use all these weapons. And that was 30 years ago. They've been buying weapons like Billy-O for the last 30 years. What is the appetite in Saudi Arabia for weapons? Or is it just crude protection money they're giving us?
They are the world's biggest arms importer. They also, I think I'm right in saying, within the top 5 or 6 military budgets in the world. So you're absolutely right, their expenditure is vast. But I think perhaps there's elements of what you've said from a number of perspectives. First of all, you're absolutely right. I think they buying vast amounts of arms from the United States and from ourselves, the United Kingdom, does buy them a certain amount of protection. We've seen that with Trump's own statements himself. He explicitly cites the arms trade again and again and again, notwithstanding actually that many of those deals, if not most, were actually secured under the Obama regime rather than his own. One of the few things that Obama has done that he actually agrees with, of course, in Trump's case. And therefore, it gives them a certain amount of free leeway. And we've seen that, of course, with the Khashoggi case. If that had been with other countries that weren't spending so much, it might have been a different outcome, certainly in terms of condemnation and so on. Incidentally, with the Trump issue with Khashoggi, of course, we also have to look very closely at Trump's personal dealings, or rather those particularly of his son-in-law, the business connections between the family, Trump, and the Saudis, particularly MBS himself. And so whilst that's a little bit off subject, it's something we have to bear in mind when it comes to policy making. But notwithstanding that, we saw on the Vox Pops there that people, generally speaking, and opinion polls show this again and again, are opposed in this country, in the United Kingdom, to these continued arms sales to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE, because of what's happening in Yemen. Now, this preceded what happened with Khashoggi. And now what we've seen after the Khashoggi case is that opinion has even more solidified, that we should not be dealing with these countries in this way. And so it's questionable how much influence they buy. But the point isn't that they buy influence with the publics of countries like America and United Kingdom, but with the elites that run those countries. For example, studies have shown that even though the figures involved in the US arms trade with Saudi Arabia are colossal, as a proportion of American exports or GDP, they're actually relatively small. And studies...
And the number of jobs is extremely small.
Extremely small compared with the American job market. It's far less than a fraction of 1%. Well, it is a fraction of 1%. But you need to see, or people need to ask, yes, but who is it that actually is benefiting here? So it's not necessarily to any great deal the American people or the American economy to such a great extent, but you look at who are the main funders of American politicians and American parties, and you'll find the oil companies, the arms companies are really high on that list. And so therefore, they carry, as in the UK, a disproportionate weight of influence with the political decision makers. And of course, that's how they want it to be. We mentioned about the public opinion aspects, and to go back with what I said, it doesn't make any difference until it gets to a critical tipping point. Now, we came with the Khashoggi situation, it looked as if that tipping point was approaching, but it's still, the jury's still out. We still don't know what's going to happen there, but it is falling into the...
I predicted a tipping point. You, more wisely, predicted that it wouldn't be.
Well, I said, let's wait and see, but I suspected that because of the powerful forces involved, I said they would probably have some kind of sham investigation that would clear MBS but blame lower officials. And indeed, that's then what's happened, because it's a tried and tested way.
Greater love hath no man than to accept his orders, carry them out, and then be beheaded for having done so. Yeah, that looks, Toby, doesn't it, like what's going to happen in the Khashoggi case? That people who were ordered by MBS to carry out this crime in Istanbul are now going to pay with their heads for it.
Well, that's certainly the position that they're trying to put forward.
Unless they disappear, these people, and don't actually execute them.
Yeah, which is more likely, because you've got to also look at the level of seniority of some of the people who are involved. They're not going to trot them out and chop off their heads. That's unlikely to happen. It is also the position that, looking at the nature of the act, looking at who was involved, that it is just impossible that MBS was not in some way involved, either giving the order or being told about it afterwards. It just could not have been carried out without his knowledge. Now, we know that the Saudis are not going to carry out any effective process. That's very, very clear. The Turks are not able to carry out a proper process because they will never be extradited to Turkey. And so the question is, how do you achieve a level of accountability outside of that? And there are ways, of course, and ways that our group is looking at, in particular, looking at their interests in Western states where they can be prosecuted, or even civil cases can be brought against them. So I'm optimistic that there will...
Don't you need a locus for that?
Yes, and you do have that.
The Khashoggi case really does puzzle me, a bit like the Hedges case in the UAE. How can Khashoggi possibly have been of sufficient importance and dangerous to the Saudi regime for them to commit such a reckless act against someone who was on first-name terms with most of the US Senate and most of the Congress, and who was a Washington insider?
Because of having the relationship that he had with so many people in the US and Western politics is what made him such a risk, such a threat to MBS in particular. You've also got to look at... Khashoggi is probably the most high-profile case that we've seen, but is certainly not the only case. So any form of criticism, because it's the same whether you're looking at the Emirati rulers or whether you're looking at MBS, their reputation globally is what drives them. We've seen it in particular with the rule of Dubai. So you hear one of the cases that I'm working on is in relation to the abduction and what we believe execution of his own daughter. Now, this was something that was coordinated between the UAE, India, with American involvement, and we can show that there was American involvement in this, all because she wanted to escape from the clutches of her father and lead a normal life, and because she had publicly criticized her father. And that was all about his reputation, what his reputation was going to be like in this country, sitting next to the Queen, whether the Queen is going to want to sit next to him once she's heard all these stories. So there is such a level of paranoia. There is this sense that one individual that has a certain level of influence with American politics can seriously damage and undermine MBS's position. Well, I can do what I like, so I'm just going to have him killed. That's what I'm going to do. But there is also the question, which hasn't really been answered yet, as to whether the intention was to execute him or whether the intention was to abduct him and take him back to Saudi Arabia.
Well, I think the presence of the bone saw in the luggage, in the hand luggage, is a bit of a giveaway in that.
Not necessarily, because of the fact you've got to look at when that person arrived. And that's what's important, was the intention to abduct him, take him back to Saudi Arabia, very much in the same way that they did with Hariri from Lebanon, and forced him to go on TV with the Crown Prince. Maybe that was their intention, to try and convince him to effectively shut up. And this whole exercise was ill-planned and resulted in Khashoggi's death. That is one theory. I don't necessarily buy that theory, but that is one theory.
Yeah. The man with the bone saw was educated in Glasgow University, and I was his Member of Parliament for a time. A narrow escape. We'll be right back. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Almayadeen television, talking about the Gulf and the West's relations with it. Let's continue. It's the last segment. Get as many speakers in as we can. The gentleman in the middle row.
Yes, my name is Joshua Megan. I live in Battersea and I work at St George's Hospital. Basically, this is kind of like a rebuttal, but a very cynical one. In my opinion, the more countries that you have, the more players and parties you have involved in that region, the more propensity there is for conflicts, because no two countries are going to share identical interests. Yes, they will all share some mutual interest somewhere down the line, but the more parties, the more countries involved in, be it Yemen, Oman, United Arab Emirates, the more countries are involved, the more propensity there is and the more likelihood there is.
That's why we fixed it that way, isn't it? Because, I mean, logically, these should all be part of a united Arabia. We fixed it this way so that there would be a division, and therefore our rule would continue. So again, that's not a failure, that's a success.
No, but what I'm saying is, in terms of, if you go along the logic, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. If it was just, say, Israel, Saudi and America that had an interest in those areas and involvement in those areas, that might actually be offer a greater propensity for hegemony and stranglehold over that area. At least if you get another party in, and another one, there is a greater likelihood for discord, so that no one imperial power can assert a hegemony over that region. There are always going to be conflicts of interest. And while I don't see it in itself as a good thing that Britain is involved in that part, at least we're seeing through this instance of Khashoggi and more recently the Briton who was jailed for life, at least it shows that the disagreement between Britain and her so-called allies, I'll put that in inverted commas because they certainly don't agree on everything, at least they through their conflict of ideologies, they will not be able to assert an overall hegemony.
Yeah, well,
as we're seeing in Iran, because Britain...
Well, you can make that argument. I've long campaigned for Britain to withdraw from NATO, for example, but I'm open to the argument that if Jeremy Corbyn was the Prime Minister of Britain, it'd be quite a good idea to be in NATO, because you could throw a very large spanner in the works of NATO thereby.
With Trump in power as well, that would just be the ultimate clash of sugar and salt, wouldn't it, really?
Indeed, yes. Julian?
Did they ever catch the Israeli operatives that murdered a Hamas man in the hotel?
What a very good question. I wish I'd thought to say that. I will. No, the gentleman behind there.
Tony Blair helped cover up the Al-Yamamah arms deal. And
he stopped the police investigation into it.
He did, and he was criticised by a court. Now, this is the problem for Corbyn. Corbyn is haunted by the Blairites in the Labour Party who would stop him from lifting the lid on something like the Al-Yamamah arms deal. And it's one of the problems around the world that people may read the scandals around Corbyn. Corbyn is a patron saint in comparison to the predecessors within the Labour Party, all of whom have pumped and covered up the Al-Yamamah arms deal.
Yes, very good point indeed. Now, sir, you're from Yemen, from Bahrain. There was once a time when we talked of little except Bahrain. There was a peaceful revolution going on. But we don't hear any more about it now. We don't feel. Has the regime won in Bahrain? Are your people finished in that regard?
No, I think to give a clear picture about what's happening, because gentleman was talking about the Arab Spring, we see the West supporting people demand in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, Syria, and other places, and they went militarily to support revolution in there.
Well, they did in Libya, yeah.
But and they did in Syria. But we see, in contrary, them militarily supporting dictatorship in Bahrain, in Saudi, and in Yemen. And they did this war in Yemen because they want to protect the legitimate country for now years, and hundreds of thousands of people and millions of people will be on starvation. They are in starvation, actually. In Bahrain, in the case of Bahrain, we have the Sixth Fleet, we have today British naval base, we have Saudi army, we have Emirati army, we have mercenaries from, from Yemen, from Jordan, from Pakistan, from everywhere, just to support Al-Khalifa. And you see those countries which the West is supporting all the way are in the Gulf. And the Gulf is the petrodollar. And I think Britain's coming back to this area to control it and manage it. In the case of Bahrain, no, people still demanding. The Bahraini government have sentenced Sheikh Ali Salman, which is the leader of the opposition, for life, just because he demanded a constitutional monarchy. The sham election, which is happening, is happening, and majority of the people have been not allowed to vote in this election. There is at least 120,000 people, as per the ex-parliament speaker, naturalized politically in Bahrain. So effectively, the government is changing the people of Bahrain. And
I was going to ask you that. They're actually changing the ethnicity and the confession balance because they're giving citizenship to foreigners.
Yes, that's what they do, because they want to get rid of the democratic demand that's happening in Bahrain, or to suppress the people using this tool. And I don't think they will succeed, because the political naturalization happening in Bahrain will have an effect on the entire Gulf, on the security level, economic level, cultural level. And we see the outcry happening in Kuwait and Qatar and UAE and in Saudi, indeed, because of the the political naturalization happening in Bahrain. So they have to stop. But I think Britain is offering their services now to run the show and manage the show in favor of this dictatorship.
Your fate is tied to the Saudi fate, isn't it? As long as Saudi Arabia remains a brute dictatorship, it's very difficult to see
unfortunately,
how little Bahrain can.
Unfortunately, that's the case. That's why they are protecting MBS all the way. Although he is clearly have his hand in Khashoggi case. And CIA knows that, Britain knows that, everybody knows that.
Well, Trump won't even listen to the tape. Toby, I asked earlier if you were optimistic and you said no, and I can understand why. But how can we change this balance of public opinion, which one day in a democracy, if that's what we are and if we remain one, will have its impact in the parliament and thus on the government?
Well, I think, just to respond also very briefly to the point that you said about Bahrain in particular. Bahrain was one of the first areas in the Middle East Gulf that I worked on, and we were campaigning for the Attorney General at that time to be removed from the International Association of Prosecutors, because how can you possibly have the highest legal authority in the country who sanctions torture actually sitting in an international organization in The Hague? That, fortunately, he has stepped down. He wasn't removed, but he is no longer in the executive committee. But I think the problem with Bahrain in particular is that our attention span is very limited. And this goes back to the global crisis, because there are so many conflicts. And we look at Bahrain, we look at what's happening in Gaza even very recently. Hopefully we will see those that are responsible held accountable in the International Criminal Court, and that's where I am optimistic. But the problem is there are so many conflicts. We have Syria, and we will, of course, eternally disagree on the situation in Syria. I consider the Assad regime to be a brutal, murderous regime that should be held accountable. But we have now Yemen. We have the Rohingya in Myanmar. We're going from conflict to conflict. So our focus on what happened before is less, because we're looking at a different conflict and priorities change. How do you change that? There has to be a concept of real accountability where individuals are held accountable for their actions. Now, that was the intention behind the creation of the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court, unfortunately, is hamstrung by the UN Security Council. And of course, in the Syria situation, Russia has impeded a referral to the International Criminal Court. But then again, so has America. America refused the Syria referral if it considered any investigations in the Golan Heights. So, I'm not putting the sole focus on Russia. But whilst you still have the 5 permanent members of the Security Council that have the ability to prevent accountability, then you will continue to have this problem. And the other focus I think that we really need to look at, it's going to be a serious consideration for Syria, and it's going to be a serious consideration for Yemen, because both countries are completely devastated. Where is the long-term commitment? Because the international community has a short-term attention span. They will look at a conflict, they will send troops, they may remove the political force at that time, and then they'll walk away. Bosnia is a particular example of that. Bosnia is still under immense political tension because it wasn't done properly. So what is the long-term commitment? We talk about rebuilding Syria. Syria will have to be rebuilt. How are we going to do that?
I think Syria can rebuild itself.
Well, I actually think...
All it needs from the West is the sight of the backs retreating, disappearing, and never coming back.
And once the regime are held accountable for the 500,000 deaths that they're responsible for, and I'm not saying that.
No, it's all right. I'll debate that with you any time that you like. Though this is about the Gulf. Though your position is identical to the position of the governments of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Oman, and all these other Gulf dictatorships you're campaigning against.
No,
does that make you feel uncomfortable?
No, it's not, because the position that I've always advocated is that crimes have been committed on a massive scale by all parties to the conflict. And all parties to the conflict have to be held accountable, because you cannot have a stable democracy unless you hold those individuals accountable. I will give an example of Bangladesh. Bangladesh had a conflict in 1971. By some accounts, 300,000 people were killed. By other accounts, 3 million people were killed. They didn't have trials. No one was held accountable. So for 40 years, they did nothing. Then they started to hold people accountable, but it became a very politically motivated process. And because there was no accountability, the cycle of violence continues. The same tensions continue to exist, and you are never able to move forward and reconcile as a people. Now, whether we agree or disagree on Syria, and the same applies to many other conflicts, is that whatever we try to do to fix the problem in terms of accountability, it is the Syrian people, it is the Yemeni people, and in any other conflict is the people of that country that are going to shoulder the greatest burden in fixing their country, regardless of which side we take. I do not believe that you can fix Syria unless you remove the dictatorship which is in place and allow the Syrian people, all Syrian people, to choose their future by rebuilding the country with our support. But it's got to be a long-term commitment. You can't do that in 12 months. You've got to recognise this is 20, 30 years.
I'm sure the Syrians will be interested in your point of view in London as to who should govern them. Charles Shoebridge, finally, the stated purpose of Britain's bases in Bahrain and in Oman is to fight ISIS and fight terrorism. Apart from the fact we're actually helping ISIS in Syria, and apart from the fact that the alphabet soup of Islamist extremism has been our ally over these years in Syria, how does it dampen down support for extremism by having foreign military bases and military personnel strutting around in Arab Muslim countries?
I think I hadn't even seen that argument, but I can well believe that that's being put forward. It's a justification, if you like, post facto for the decisions that have been made to have these bases and to have these massive capital projects like the aircraft carriers. For example, without the 2 aircraft carriers, we may not have needed, as they now argue, to have these bases to service them in these areas. And of course, those decision-making predates even the emergence of ISIS and the predecessors of ISIS, and indeed ISIS for a while, were indeed, as Hillary Clinton had pointed out to her, was revealed by the WikiLeaks memos and so on, these people were our allies in Syria because they were seeking, alongside the British, French and American governments, Saudi and Qatari governments, to overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad. And of course, they were also our allies in Libya before that, not called ISIS then, but of course their predecessors. And so, if you like, it's a classic situation where many have pointed out, oh, we create or at least foster an extremist problem in certain countries. They do our bidding for us. They undermine regimes and governments that we don't like. And then when it all turns bad, we use them as the pretext for then actually setting up military bases. For example, that is exactly the same argument that America is using not to withdraw its troops from Syria, notwithstanding that, of course, its real reason is to assist Israel in preventing the expansion of influence of Iran.
I told you we wouldn't all agree, but I hope you've all enjoyed and learned something from this debate. I've been George Galloway. This has been Kalima Horra.